There's no room in the limo. My cousin shrugged as they drove off to Grandpa's funeral without me. I took an Uber in silence. When the will was read, everyone turned to me, and I didn't say a word. I just smiled after hearing the will reading and vanished after taking what was mine. I, 32M, stood on the sidewalk watching the black limousine pull away from the curb, leaving me behind with nothing but the echo of my cousin's words ringing in my ears. There's no room in the limo, he'd said with that dismissive shrug I'd seen 1,000 times before. Through the tinted windows, I could make out at least 3 empty seats. The funeral was in 40 minutes, and I was 20 miles from the church. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber, standing there in my dark suit while neighbors pretended not to notice. The driver arrived 12 minutes later, a kind older man who didn't ask questions when he saw where we were headed. I spent the ride staring out the window, thinking about Grandpa and wondering why I'd expected today to be any different. My family had always treated me like an afterthought, the forgotten child of the forgotten son. My father had been the black sheep, the one who'd chosen a simple life as a teacher instead of joining the family's real estate business. When he died in a car accident when I was 8, Mom and I became even more invisible to them. We'd moved 3 states away, and the family barely noticed we were gone. Grandpa was different, though. He'd kept in touch, called every week, visited twice a year. He'd been the only one who remembered my birthday, who asked about my work as a civil engineer, who actually listened when I talked. When Mom died from cancer 5 years ago, he was the only family member who came to the funeral. The Uber pulled up to the church 15 minutes before the service. I could see the limousine parked prominently at the front entrance. My aunt emerged from it, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My uncle followed, then my 3 cousins, all dressed in designer black, their grief as carefully curated as their Instagram posts. I paid the driver, added a generous tip, and walked toward the church entrance. My aunt saw me, and her expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or annoyance. She turned away without acknowledgement. My uncle at least nodded, though his eyes slid past me quickly, already looking for someone more important to greet. Inside, the church was filling with people I half recognized from childhood visits. Business partners, country club friends, members of the family dynasty I'd never been part of. I found a seat in the 3rd row from the back. No one saved me a spot up front with the family. No one looked for me. The service was exactly what Grandpa would have hated. Impersonal, stuffy, full of platitudes from people who'd barely known him. My aunt gave a tearful speech about what a wonderful father he'd been, conveniently omitting the 15 years she'd spent in California barely calling him. My uncle talked about his business acumen and legacy. My cousins each said a few words about cherished memories that I suspected were heavily embellished, if not entirely fabricated. No one asked me to speak. I thought about standing up anyway, about telling everyone how Grandpa used to take me fishing every summer, how he'd taught me to play chess and let me win until I was good enough to beat him fairly, how he'd called me the week before he died to tell me he was proud of the bridge project I'd been managing. But I stayed silent. These people didn't care about the real man. They cared about the estate. After the service, everyone drove to the cemetery in a procession of luxury vehicles. I caught another Uber. At the graveside, I stood at the back of the crowd while the family clustered around the casket. My youngest cousin, who couldn't have been more than 25, spent most of the burial scrolling through her phone. When it was over, my aunt announced that everyone was invited back to Grandpa's house for the reception and reading of the will. She made eye contact with several people as she said it, making sure the important guests knew they were wanted. Her gaze skipped right over me. I went anyway. The house looked different. Grandpa had lived in the same sprawling colonial for 40 years, but it felt cold now, like a museum instead of a home. The rooms were full of people eating catered food and networking. I heard snatches of conversation about property values and investment opportunities. Someone was already discussing what the house might sell for. I made myself a plate and stood in the corner of the dining room, watching. My cousins were holding court in the living room, already spending their inheritance in their minds. My aunt and uncle moved through the crowd like politicians, shaking hands and accepting condolences with practiced grace. An hour passed. Then the family lawyer arrived, a thin man with silver hair and an expensive briefcase. My aunt started herding people toward the study. Grandpa's study had always been off-limits when we were kids, a sanctuary full of books and photographs and the smell of pipe tobacco. Now it was crowded with eager relatives. I slipped in last and stood by the door. The lawyer sat up at Grandpa's desk, pulling out documents. My aunt and uncle took the chairs directly in front of the desk. My cousins arranged themselves nearby, practically vibrating with anticipation. Various other relatives I barely knew filled in the remaining seats. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. The first part was standard stuff: small bequests to longtime employees and modest donations to charities. My aunt inherited Grandpa's collection of antique watches. My uncle got the vintage car. Each cousin received some jewelry or art pieces. Then came the real estate. Grandpa had been wealthy, not extravagantly so, but comfortable. He owned the house we were in, worth at least $2 million, plus a vacation property on the coast and a rental building downtown. The collective value was substantial. The lawyer continued reading. Grandpa's investment portfolio was detailed, his stock holdings listed. There was a murmur of approval through the room. My aunt was already calculating. I could see it in her eyes. My uncle leaned forward, listening intently for his name. But the lawyer kept reading, and their names didn't come. The real estate holdings, the bulk of the investment portfolio, the business interests, all of it was going to someone else. The lawyer read the name clearly, twice. Every head in the room turned toward me. I stood by the door, keeping my expression neutral. My aunt's mouth had fallen open. My uncle's face was turning red. My cousins looked between me and the lawyer like there had been some mistake, like someone was playing a joke in terrible taste. The lawyer continued. Grandpa had left me everything that mattered. The house, the properties, the investments, the business holdings. The total value was north of $8 million. The letter attached to the will was read aloud per Grandpa's instructions. In it, he explained his reasoning with the blunt honesty that had defined him. He wrote about how I was the only one who'd visited him in the nursing home during his final year, the only one who'd called just to talk rather than to ask for money. He mentioned how my aunt had tried to convince him to sign over power of attorney to her, how my uncle had suggested investments that would primarily benefit himself, how my cousins had only shown up when they wanted something. He wrote about my father, his youngest son, the one who'd chosen happiness over wealth and had been ostracized for it. He wrote about how proud he was of me, how I'd built a good life through hard work rather than inheritance. He said he trusted me to do something meaningful with what he was leaving behind. The room was completely silent except for the lawyer's voice reading Grandpa's words. When he finished, he looked up at me and asked if I had any questions. I told him no, that everything was clear. My aunt found her voice first. She stood up, her face pale with rage, and demanded to know how this could be legal. The lawyer explained calmly that Grandpa had been of sound mind, that the will had been properly executed, that there were no grounds for contestation. My uncle started making threats about fighting it in court. The lawyer, still calm, noted that Grandpa had anticipated this and included a clause stating that anyone who challenged the will would forfeit even their small bequests. My cousins were in shock. The oldest one finally looked at me directly and asked what I was going to do with everything. There was a desperate edge to the question, a hope that maybe I'd share, that maybe I'd remember we were family. I smiled. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. It was the smile of someone who'd spent decades being invisible finally being seen. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would change anything or make them understand. I walked over to the lawyer and confirmed what documents I'd need to sign and when we could meet at his office. He handed me a sealed envelope that Grandpa had left for me personally and told me we could handle the rest of the paperwork early next week. I thanked him, tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket, and turned to leave. My aunt stepped into my path. She asked if I was really going to do this, if I was really going to take everything and leave the rest of the family with nothing. I reminded her, quietly, that they weren't getting nothing. They were getting exactly what Grandpa thought they deserved. Then I asked if she remembered leaving me on the sidewalk this morning, telling me there was no room in the limo. She had nothing to say to that. I walked out of the study, through the house full of stunned relatives, and out the front door. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. I stood on the porch of what was now my house and pulled out my phone to order another Uber. Before it arrived, I opened the envelope Grandpa had left me. Inside was a handwritten letter, his shaky script covering both sides of the paper. He told me again how proud he was, how sorry he was that the rest of the family had never appreciated me, how he hoped this inheritance would give me the security and opportunities one deserved. He also asked me to forgive him for putting me in this position, for making me the target of their anger and resentment. At the bottom, he'd written one more thing. He said that wealth and family were both what we made of them, and he trusted me to make something good. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope as my Uber arrived. The driver was the same kind older man from that morning. He recognized me and asked if the funeral had gone okay. I told him it had been interesting. He laughed and said funerals usually were. During the 40-minute drive back to my apartment, I started making plans. I'd keep Grandpa's house, at least for now. It would need work to feel like a home again rather than a mausoleum, but I could do that. The rental property was already generating income, and I'd keep managing it the way Grandpa had, fairly and responsibly. The vacation house I'd probably sell. I didn't need two properties, and someone else could enjoy it. The investments I'd leave mostly alone except to diversify a bit more. I made good money as an engineer, and this inheritance meant I'd never have to worry about security again. It also meant I could do more with my career, take on interesting projects instead of just profitable ones, maybe start my own firm eventually. The business holdings were the complicated part. Grandpa had owned significant shares in several companies, including the family real estate firm that my uncle ran. That would require careful thought and probably the help of a good financial advisor. My phone started buzzing with calls and texts before I even got home. My aunt, my uncle, my cousins, even relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. I let them all go to voicemail. There was nothing to discuss. Grandpa had made his decision, and I wasn't going to apologize for it or give away what he'd entrusted to me. The next few weeks were intense. My aunt did try to contest the will despite the lawyer's warning, and she lost both the challenge and her antique watch collection. My uncle threatened me through his lawyers, then tried to convince me to sell him back the shares of the family business at a fraction of their value. I declined. My cousins tried various approaches: anger, guilt, sob stories about debt, and failed businesses. None of it worked. What they didn't understand was that I didn't take pleasure in their disappointment. I wasn't keeping Grandpa's estate out of spite or revenge. I was keeping it because he'd wanted me to have it, and because I would honor his wishes. Their behavior afterward only confirmed how right he'd been. I moved into Grandpa's house 3 months after the funeral. I'd had it deep cleaned and redecorated, replacing the heavy curtains with something lighter, filling it with plants and photographs and books. I turned his study into a home office and set up a drafting table by the window where he used to read. The family stopped reaching out after the first year. I ran into my aunt once at a restaurant, and we pretended not to see each other. I heard through former mutual connections that my cousins were working regular jobs now, that my uncle had to downsize his lifestyle. None of it brought me any satisfaction. What did bring me satisfaction was the scholarship fund I established in my father's name, giving money to students pursuing careers in teaching and engineering. It was the bridge project I completed using some of the inheritance to fund better materials and safety features than the city had budgeted for. It was the mentorship program I started at the local high school, teaching kids about structural engineering and showing them that success could come from passion and hard work rather than family connections. I kept Grandpa's ashes in an urn on the fireplace mantel until the first anniversary of his death, then scattered them at his favorite fishing spot, the same lake where he'd taught me to cast a line 25 years earlier. I went alone. None of the family knew about it. Standing there on the shore, watching the ashes drift across the water in the morning light, I finally said the words I hadn't been able to say at his funeral. I told him about the projects I was working on, about the house and how I'd made it warm again, about how I was trying to use his gift to make a difference. I told him I missed him. I told him thank you. The wind picked up, rippling the surface of the lake, and for just a moment, I could almost hear his laugh. I drove home to the house that had been his and was now mine, to the life I was building from the foundation he'd provided. My phone stayed silent. My family stayed distant. And I was, for the first time in as long as I could remember, exactly where I was supposed to be.